Hello and welcome to another episode of the Thom and Joe show. I am Tom.
I'm Joe.
And joining us, well, would you like to introduce yourself?
I am the special guest Jude VC from LateFrequencies.
Yes, a friend of mine going back a number of years. I've done a split
We were
EP.
on an album together.
We did a split EP. This person
yeah, we need to do another. It was not an EP. It was a full-length album, remember?
It was a full-length album. We did music together. And I thought, well,
is that on Bandcamp?
Yes, it is on Bandcamp. I believe you own it, Joe. If you, for those
okay, I do own it. Okay.
The album is called Mega Necropolis.
Yes.
Okay, I do have that one. Yes.
It's the one with the Bill and Ted Electric Football on the front.
Yeah, in the style of Joy Division.
In the style of Joy Division. So yeah, we have come together. We have brought a special guest on because we are talking about one of the most influential albums of all time, the Velvet Underground's 1967 full-length album, The Velvet Underground and Nico, which... Where do we start with this album? We are talking, I mean, this is, I prefaced it by calling it one of the most influential albums of all time, but I think we need to sort of put this album a little bit in context, I guess.
Yeah, we do. Let's talk about what kind of music was popular back then.
It's the mid-60s. It's, you know, to put it into perspective, the Beatles have released Revolver 9 months before. The Rolling Stones are sort of going through their weird psychedelic period. Jimi Hendrix has just jumped off a plane in London and is about to play Eric Clapton off the stage. Yeah, we're sort of.
And not to mention, you've also got a lot of folk music and stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Dylan has recently gone elected. We're talking, you know, the sort of the period really before psychedelia takes hold, but sort of, you know, you're getting elements of sort of, you know, musical freakouts and sort of, you know, I mean, Pink Floyd will release Piper in the Gates of Dawn, you know, several months later. So we're talking, you know, the verge of psychedelia. And across the sea in New York, this drops in March of 1967 to resounding.
You know, on the subject of psychedelia, I should. That does remind me. The Velvet Underground were very at odds with the quote peace and love crap, as most Tucker put it, which I think is important in juxtaposing them with the zeitgeist at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you got to consider, like, you know, Greenwich in New York in the same period is sort of. You know,
absolutely, yeah. They
sort of
a lot of time there.
It's nice, it's nice, twangy, you know, pretty acoustic coffee shop music.
Yeah,
but
yeah, this sort of drops with a resounding reaction to it is
if I may throw more obscure,
some of which we'll go into.
If I may throw more obscure stuff into here, it was the Key the Metal Idol of its day, which Key the Metal Idol was an anime that was unknown for years until
that's what I've heard of it. It's an anime.
It's an anime, yeah. But before there was Serial Experiments Lane, which was one of the most influential and biggest anime of its time. There was this, which didn't quite have the rules down for how we were going to do this subversive, weird story about this little girl who is super powered or something's wrong with her. But, you know, it didn't quite have the rules yet, and nobody really cared about it when it came out. But certainly a lot of people cribbed from it and then made, you know, stuff that was bigger and, you know, became one of the defining voices at the time. So I think it was Brian Eno who said this only sold 30,000 copies in its first 5 years, but every 30,000 every person who bought it started a band. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean that's there are.
Weren't we talking about the actual
we were talking,
numbers?
we looked at this, and there is the number of it is a little bit higher than Eno's sort of number. And actually, Reed was very much sort of like, Brian, shut up and go away. You don't actually know what which is ironic considering they both, you know, collaborated extensively with David Bowie. Bowie would go on to produce Lou Reed's solo album Transform, and obviously Brian Eno's work with David Bowie is extensive. But it's sort of like this, you've got to consider, this does not sell well. It doesn't, it's a curio. It's sort of, a little bit of, a lot of people are going, this is sort of, it cribs off thing. It's sort of, a bit of a left field approach. But everybody who goes and buys this record goes and starts a band. And this is sort of, 10 years down the line, we're seeing things like, the New York New Wave. We're seeing things like the Patti Smith Band. We're seeing Television who owe a considerable debt, to the extent that obviously John Cale produces Patti Smith's Horses, her first studio album. This intermeshes back in. So I think we need to start at the beginning. Who are the Velvet Underground?
All right. Who do we want to talk about first? Lou Reed?
Let's talk about Lou Reed. Why not? Let's start with Lou.
Well, I'm going to quote something that Sterling Morrison said of his background. Lou's parents would like a nice Jewish boy. Instead, they have this R&B freak and doo-wop devotee.
So, yeah, Reed is essentially... I hesitate to call him the leader of the Velvet Underground, although he would probably quite like...
Oh, he absolutely would like you to think that.
That description. Now, before the Velvet Underground, he is obviously this sort of, it matches the two elements that sort of typify Reed's songwriting, which is he writes a lot, but he also does because obviously he studied journalism. Yeah, but he also then went into, I believe, jingle writing. Am I correct in thinking?
Yes, he did. Well, here's what he did. He went to work at a place called Pickwick Records, which was essentially trying to get people to write like dime a dozen songs, capitalizing on fads of the time, especially surf music. That keeps coming up whenever I read about it. And his work at Pickwick was actually how the Velvet Underground started. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, because obviously at the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed bumps into a Welsh viola player called John Cale.
John Cale.
Basically, they bond over a method which obviously comes back when the Velvet Underground sort of get musically started, called ostrich guitar, which is essentially...
Yes, the ostrich. That's how... that's what I was going to talk about.
Which essentially is a guitar tune, so all the notes on it are the same, and they sort of, Cale looks at this and goes, well, what you're doing for this novelty song is exactly the same thing I'm doing over with the hugely influential experimental composer Lamonte Young. And it's sort of like, this is astonishingly the same.
Yeah, and that's when he's like, wow, my drone composition could actually work in rock and roll.
Yeah, so a little bit on Cale. Cale obviously hails from Wales.
Want to hear some fucked up things about his childhood?
There's so, like, this is a variety of just fucked up things about everybody's childhood. Yeah, what Cale is, Cale has got a really screwed up childhood. I mean, considering his comparison is Lou Reed, a guy who had to undergo conversion therapy because his parents were convinced that their son will obviously was So I mean, Cale is actually one of the two members of the Velvet Underground that are still obviously with us at the time of recording. But no, it's sort of Cale is an experimental composer. Obviously, he ends up recording for the BBC at like age 10 or 11.
Oh wow! I didn't learn that.
And obviously, he then travels to the States. He gets himself involved with a group called Fluxus, who obviously hugely influential New York arts group, which includes obviously the composer John Cage and obviously Yoko Ono. But no, absolutely. So they meet. They essentially go, "Let's start a band."
Yeah, Fluxus. It was an art movement consisting of people who were tired of elitism, and in particular, they admired futurism and Dadaism, especially the performance-based aspects of these types of art. Yeah. So you can see how that would appeal to somebody like John Cale.
Absolutely. So Cale
and his performances consisted of just like destroying pianos, and that just all labeled quote too violent.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking, you know, at the point where musical experimentalism meets theatrical experimental and meets artistic experimental, which is sort of this very nascent sense in sort of early 60s New York. Cale brings on his friend Sterling Morrison. A little bit about Sterling Morrison, please.
Okay.
As I said, Morrison is the one I know least about, which is sort of an interesting thing to say the least, considering he
was an old friend of Lou Reed's from Syracuse. He was a former trumpet player. He was a guitarist and a holder of the belief that, to quote Joe Harvard, rock music should make folks want to tear shit up.
Yeah.
He and Lou Reed met in autumn 1961, and the way they met, Jim Tucker, brother of Maureen Tucker, this comes up later, who was a friend of the members of the Velvet Underground, or the people who would become the Velvet Underground. Jim Tucker's roommate, Bob Davidson, had a huge music collection. He would listen to blues and jazz and, quote, real funky stuff, as Morrison himself put it. So this guy had a radio show, was eventually kicked off of it, and it was on some weird time slot where he would play all this doo-wop and, you know, the sort of thing that Lou Reed would love. And he was playing these records very, very loudly in his room. And Sterling Morrison and Lou Reed both went up there, and they're like, "Hey, this stuff is actually really great." And he was like, "Wow, I thought you were going to tell me to turn it down." And Lou Reed and Morrison met over that.
Yeah, so that's sort of which is probably the most normal meeting of like anyone in the world. So
truly, but just bonding over someone else's music—that's pretty normal.
The band sort of bring on a drummer in the form of a cultist and you know, general all-round interesting art figure, Angus McLeish, who is essentially then gonna essentially jettison from the band because he wouldn't turn up to practice record sessions except when he wanted. The band go through a number of names, eventually settling on The Velvet Underground, which is a book by author Michael Lee about the sexual subcultures of the 1960s.
Didn't they go through all those name changes because venues would refuse to book them again because they were that bad?
This is also very true. It's like they were sort of they had a bit of a reputation even at this point. And the band eventually take on obviously Mo Tucker, who's essentially one of Sterling Morrison's friends. In the intervening period,
sister of a friend.
Sister of a friend. They get their first gig to open at Summit High School.
Well, let's talk about Mo Tucker's playing style a little bit and where she comes from.
So there is a great documentary which I'll link below when this does go live about. There is a full documentary. Like, Mo Tucker is one of the unsung like drummers of the 60s.
If it's the documentary I'm thinking of.
It's definitely
it's the one where she tells the story about how she was driving home from class and she heard on the radio in the car the Rolling Stones cover of Not Fade Away, and she just had to pull over because it was so engrossing and amazing to her.
Yeah, so there's an interesting side of it. I'm just going to do one of our infamous side points. Cale goes back to England with a demo of the Velvet Underground, right, at the very early period, and tries to give this tape to Marianne Faithfull. Hoping Marianne Faithfull would obviously pass it on to Faithfull's associate, and I believe at that point then boyfriend Mick Jagger. So there is an alternate universe where Mick Jagger listens to this and goes, "Holy shit, this is sort of, you know, really experimental and interesting. I need to sign this." You got to remember, obviously, this is about the same time as Brian Jones was doing his explorations to Morocco and recording the master musicians of Jujuka. So, you know, there's this alternate reality where the Velvet Underground come out on the Rolling Stones' own label. Anyway, but yeah, Mo is sort of an interesting, the nearest comparison, and I don't mean this as like an insult. I mean, in the economy of her playing and, you know, the way that she essentially uses what is at most points a very limited set. I mean, at most points during the Velvet Underground's history, she is playing a bass drum, and a snare and another snare, and occasionally cymbals.
Yeah,
Which,
she would play a tom-tom and a bass drum on its side, and she would play it with mallets.
Yeah. Now the comparison I would honestly
and none of her parts are very busy.
No.
It's just this super simple, unrelenting beat.
Yeah, absolutely. The nearest person I would honestly compare it to is, ironically, Meg White. It's that same tying it in place. You know, she playing exactly what the music needs. You know, I don't think the Velvet Underground's music needs a complicated drum style.
It really doesn't.
No. I mean, at one point she gets her drums kit stolen, and she just goes, I'm just going to bring these garbage cans in there.
And then she did.
Yeah, but her style is sort of influenced by African drumming, which she obviously was into as a student. And essentially the Velvet Underground form, they get a regular gig at the Cafe Bazaar in New York, and things are going swimmingly until enter Andy Warhol.
Yes.
So
okay.
I don't think we need to generally have like a who is Andy Warhol, because I don't know if you've got sort of 20 minutes into this podcast to go, but who is Andy Warhol? By this point, Andy Warhol, who's probably one of the most famous artists in the world at this point, is basically going into a multimedia roadshow, which is called the
Exploding Plastic Inevitable.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, which is sort of a mixture of his filmmaking, various art pieces. It's sort of
superstars were dancing on stage.
Yeah. So there's obviously a little bit more to that meeting than obviously it's just, Andy Warhol walks into Cafe Bazaar.
Well, first, it wasn't Andy Warhol at first. First, it was Gerard Malanga, a future whip dancer in the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. He got advice from Barbara Rubin, a quote-unquote art groupie, who was like, hey, you should go to the Cafe Bazaar. There is this band called the Velvet Underground playing there. And you know how Andy's been trying to find a rock band to manage? Well, I think this could be just the band. And so he went, and he was wowed by them. And the next night, he brought in Andy Warhol, who was equally impressed, and that's how that happened.
Yeah, but obviously, by this point, Warhol is like, Warhol is into almost this sort of total art, this idea of just, of having everything. I mean, at this point, he is making narrative films, he's making, experimental film. He's obviously producing art and sculpture at a frankly astonishing rate. And it's sort of, he becomes, and then obviously, this is Warhol going, okay, now I have another discipline to go into to sort of do other things in. So he basically goes, I'm going to manage you. And by the way, here's somebody I think could work quite well with you.
Are you talking about Nico?
I am talking about Nico.
Well, here's the thing. Andy Warhol was not the first one to say that. It was Paul Morrissey's idea at first, because okay, let's talk about who Paul Morrissey is.
Yeah. the second worst Morrissey in music.
Yeah. I think Morrissey is just a name for people who suck.
It's not good. Apologies to anyone called Morrissey. We are listening to.
So anyway, he's a filmmaker. His films are the very strange thing about them. So he is a massive conservative who praises Mitt Romney, but his films are about things like drug use and quote-unquote sexual debauchery, and they feature full frontal nudity and stuff like that. He also cast trans women as cis women in his movies, which is really strange for someone like that.
Yeah.
But the reason he portrays these things, and this is just very strange, he doesn't seek to glorify them, understandable. He portrays them because he thinks they are, quote, stupid, which I find strange, because when I think about things I want to portray, I don't think things that I think are stupid.
Yeah, it's almost like Fox News. It's like, look,
I guess so.
It's like, look at all this morally reprehensible stuff. That's our channel. That's the other channel.
Yeah, I
But
guess.
no,
Yeah, that's Paul Morrissey, all right.
that's Paul Morrissey. He's like, yeah. But so
But
Morrissey, yeah. So Paul Morrissey and Nico,
oh yeah, and he has major beef with Andy Warhol.
because of course he does.
Because, well, yeah, Paul Morrissey just gets mad at everyone for anything.
Hmm. So
In the interview I read with him, there is a part where he gets so angry with the interviewer that it's a phone interview. He has to set down the phone and walk away for a bit. And then when he comes back, he's kind of confused as to who he's talking to and what this conversation is about.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, Nico is not is not comparatively a neophyte to musical and indeed acting stardom. So Nico is...
the reason the reason to tie it back to Paul Morrissey back to this, Morrissey did not care for Lou Reed. He didn't think he could sing. He didn't think Lou Reed had like that attractive rock star image enough to appeal to an audience. So he's like, how about we get someone beautiful and also someone who I can work with? And that's Nico.
That's Nico. So Nico is, Nico, real name Christina God, I've bad with names. Kafkan is obviously, as the name may suggest, a German, was a German vocalist and actress. Essentially, she spends time. She leaves Germany in the sort of the late 1950s to obviously become a writer for Vogue and various other magazines, and becomes an act. And then she eventually, I mean, even before she runs into the Velvet Underground, she's doing some incredible stuff. So Coco, she was potentially going to be a model for Coco Chanel because, hey, why not? But she fled to New York to escape Coco Chanel, which, given Coco Chanel's activities during the Second World War, is hardly surprising. She appears briefly in Federico Fellini's La Dolce Vita, and Jean-Paul Belmonto's A Man Named Rocker, then appears on the cover of a jazz album, then appears in another film, which where she records a song for a film called Striptease, where she collaborates with Serge Gainsbourg, then goes to London, records a single with Brian Jones, with a B-side that features Jimmy Page. It's like, even before that, then she bumps into Bob Dylan in Paris in 1965, then leaves to the United States, and obviously at this point comes into contact with obviously Warhol and the Factory, records the song I'll Keep It With Mine for the album Chelsea Girl, and at this point finally we come back to the Velvet Underground, who eventually agree, because I believe there was some dislike or some sort of enmity between the Velvets and Nico. Am I mistaken in that? Or
well, there's animosity between her and Lou Reed, strangely enough, they had a bit of a thing. That's where the song I'll Be Your Mirror came from.
Yeah.
But it was not so much animosity as it was distance on Nico's part. When she wasn't singing, she would just be sitting by herself. She'd be writing lyrics and poetry. She'd be doing her own thing. When she wasn't needed, she didn't really participate.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's simply because Lou Reed made her feel unwelcome, or if she just would rather be doing different things, but that's how it was.
I mean, certainly she appears on, I think it's 5. Is it 5?
It's
no, it's
3 songs.
3 songs of the album.
Well, it's 4 tracks. She does the backing vocals on Sunday morning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And she sings Femme Fatale, I'll Be Your Mirror, and All Tomorrow's Parties.
Yeah.
The latter of which was Warhol's favorite song, possibly because it was his superstar singing about his factory, because those lyrics are totally about the Warhol factory.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll get to track by track in a bit. So by this point, the basically the Velvet Underground plus Nico are essentially sort of the house band for the Exploding Plastic Inevitable.
You know, one fact I discovered about Nico that I would like to share.
Okay.
She was apparently a violent white supremacist.
Oh.
Yeah.
Joy.
There's an anecdote where she was at the Chelsea Hotel with a bunch of other musicians sitting and drinking. There was a mixed race black woman. She was a singer.
Yeah.
And apropos of very little, Nico smashed her wine glass, stabbed it in the woman's eye, and said, "I hate black people."
Yeah. This is by the way, you know, considering like pretty much everybody in the Velvet Underground either had a drug dependency or a drug problem, pretty much par for the course for like all of them apart from Mo, who pretends, as I said, Mo Tucker is a fascinating figure in that Mo
now,
Tucker.
What was the thing you said when I said there were quote? She said there were quote no smackheads in the band, and you were like, meaning. One, I was incredibly inobservant. Two, I turned a blind eye. And/or three, I was too messed up on things other than smack to notice.
Yeah, absolutely. That's like, I'm not meaning to be rude. If you do not notice, your other three band members plus your guest vocalist are like
doing heroin
on something. Yeah,
singing about it.
It's like,
and about half the album is about this.
Yeah, like so Lou Reed. Let's get as a brief aside into the band's various drug dependency, because why not? We're gonna get this demonetized.
Okay, let's talk about the drug. So do y'all know what Thorazine is?
Oh boy.
Joe, do you know what Thorazine is?
Explain it for the audience.
Thorazine is an old antipsychotic used to treat schizophrenia and general nervous breakdowns in like the 1950s. Lou Reed was prescribed it after his nervous breakdown after he tried his first semester at college. It is not a good drug.
Yeah, it's not the sort of thing you take going, oh, we're gonna have a really good time on
it
Thorazine.
Makes you catatonic. You just kind of wander aimlessly. That's where the phrase Thorazine shuffle came from, that stereotyped movement of people in mental hospitals that you might see in films and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
that's a Thorazine for you. And these guys would get phony prescriptions for Thorazine so they could take it recreationally. They washed it down with beer and hoped that they would be alive in the morning. And in the words of Sterling Morrison, since we were young, we were alive in the morning.
Yeah, Nico has I don't know if the heroin addiction started at this point. She was certainly suffering from heroin problems basically from the point this album was recorded onwards.
If I'm not mistaken, she started heroin to lose weight during her days as a model.
Oh boy, so so back and forth, yeah. John Cale has now. This is perhaps, as I said, where John Cale's horrifying backstory just continues to happen. So John, I believe, was it something from his childhood?
He's opiate use started when he was a kid. He was very, very ill and was prescribed painkillers. The kind that you might not want to prescribe to a child.
Yeah. I mean, this is obviously the UK before the National Health Service. Where just yeah, sure.
This is what you give a kid with bronchitis.
Let's give him opiates. Why not?
It was basically just opium, and by his own recollection, he would just sit up in his bed watching the flowers in the wallpaper change.
Oh God. Yeah. I don't think. Do we know much about, because Sterling Morrison, the problem is with Sterling Morrison is compared to
we're not talking about Sterling. I'm sorry, I'm talking about John Cale. I got mixed up.
Well, did Morrison have any? Because Morrison, I feel like Morrison is like
I don't know,
the straight guy in the band, and it's like
he's the guy who was talking about the Thorazine.
Oh God! And Mo
that was coming from him. That was from an interview with him.
And Mo is like, yeah, I don't know, nobody's doing drugs in the band.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the drug use. So, but anyway, by this point, obviously, the Velvet Underground and their various chemical dependencies have sort of arrived at a point where they are, fairly, they are basically Andy Warhol's band.
Yeah.
And they essentially go, McLeish tries to come back when Reed was suffering from hepatitis. Mo apparently was on bass at this point, which is an intriguing, intriguing period. This is released as a bootleg, which I believe is doing the rounds. McLeish tries to then rejoin on drums. And then sort of people are like, no, it's not working, and he eventually just leaves the band for good. I mean, even at this point, the Velvet, people are wanting to get back into the Velvet Underground.
Right.
This point, by the way, just as a side thing, the Velvet Underground having to wear sunglasses on stage because of the light show and the projections and everything.
See, what I read from Mo Tucker was that she in specific started wearing the sunglasses because she was nervous.
I mean, it may well be like bits of both. I mean,
that could be true for her.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of the photographs of the band of this period are basically 4 slightly severe-looking sort of people in sunglasses looking pretty damn cool. I mean, not every other photograph you have of Lou Reed for this period, Lou is wearing sunglasses. Now, is that to block against the light? Is that because of stage fright? Is that because he is on so many drugs that he is just, unable to really deal with bright light? Don't know. Anyway, they look fucking cool. So essentially, the Velvet Underground released their first actual record, which is on a part of the magazine called Aspen, which in the most 1960s thing possible, one side is recorded by the Velvet Underground, which is a section called Loop, and which is actually kind of an interesting precursor to both the drone work that Cale would obviously do as a solo musician, and obviously Lou Reed's infamous Metal Machine music.
Yes.
Which is an album just generally. We'll get to it at some point, won't we, Joe? Metal Machine.
Joy.
Metal Machine
Looking
music.
Forward to it.
The only Lou Reed album to be less listenable than Lulu. Because I will inflict Lulu on our audience at some point, and you will like it because it's a good album.
Well, you're not going to inflict on the audience because the audience doesn't have to listen to it because we'll get copyright struck.
They just have to
You're
listen to
inflict
us
it upon
talk
me,
about
and
it.
I get to talk about it.
But Joe, James Hetfield is the table.
But I've already watched the Star Wars holiday special with you, Tama.
Oh yeah, we all have our crosses to bear. So anyway, that's the first music by the Velvet Underground. The other side is music by an associate of Timothy Leary, the guy who brought LSD to popularity.
Yes.
So, and then finally we arrive in the 1966. We arrive to SEPTA Studios in New York City, and we are ready to record this album. So, I think we need to talk about this album, the appearance of this album, because I mean, this is one of the greatest album covers of all time.
Oh yeah, Andy Warhol did it.
In fact, it might pretty much be the only thing Andy actually does on this record.
Yeah.
Apart from Bankroll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually that album cover was part of the reason that the album's release was delayed. As we all know, the iconic banana on the cover was actually a sticker covering a pink, rather phallic peeled banana. And the reason they did something novel like this was probably an attempt to emphasize Warhol's involvement in the hopes that it'd sell more copies that way. But making the special machinery needed to print that is part of why the album took so long to release.
Warhol would, I think, in the same year or later that year, also produce the cover for the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers, which is also a little bit gimmicky and also apparently delayed the release of the album because, hey, putting a working zipper on the front of an album cover is not exactly a common thing. But anyway, it is it is probably the most famous thing. I mean, this is probably one of Warhol's single most famous image, single pieces of artwork.
Yeah.
Copies of this with the an unpeeled banana go for absolutely ridiculous money. And of course, inevitably in 2012, Andy Warhol's foundation went to legal battle with the Velvet Underground because the Velvet Underground were not entirely happy about the Warhol Foundation using probably the most famous Velvet Underground related image for phone and iPad cases. So, yeah, this is without mentioning the... sorry, Joe.
Yeah, it's also the back cover. Yes. Because there was a little known actor who was projected on the stage when they were performing it on the back cover.
Disgraced Warhol superstar, Eric Emerson.
Yeah.
And he sued them because they were using his image and he wanted royalties for it. And so MGM, I mean, he didn't really have a case, but MGM, in case the judges decide what the fuck ever, just put a black sticker on it.
Yeah.
And just problem solved.
Yeah. Again, if you've got a copy with the original Emerson back cover, you are probably going to be able to put a fair down payment on a house because these are rare. The most versions of this just airbrush Emerson out. It's just now a blank thing in the background. Very rarely is the album obviously released nowadays with the sticker. Unfortunately, these days it's just a flat image. There's a Japanese reissue in the 1980s which is worth a fair bit of money, which has a peelable banana. On the CD reissue, the banana is actually physically on the jewel case. The peeled banana is beneath the CD, and back in 2008, the sticker was back anyway. So that's probably the most famous album cover. Frankly, I would probably say this goes alongside Sgt. Pepper and another couple of big 60s records as just this infamous, very very cool. I mean, the band name is not even on the cover. The band name appears on the back of the record. It's like, no, this is an Andy Warhol show. This is Andy's silk screen banana. This is Andy's sort of stamp upon the music that he otherwise has very little to do with in terms of the production. So, yeah, so the general... Because we've sort of talked about the Velvet Underground as a band, but we haven't really talked about how they sound. So I think obviously we need to go through. So Lou Reed plays guitar and vocals. Lou Reed's guitar style is sort of a very skeletal. He's got a very minimal style to play. It's usually sort of, fairly open chords or, interesting sort of guitar work on that.
Cale... Speaking of the guitar work, a thing that they would do a lot was they'd take a song with only 3 or 4 chords and they'd get a whole lot of complexity out of it by playing interlocking parts. And they also didn't like playing a song the same way twice. Like if you listen to, I was listening to I'll Be Your Mirror in specific, the guitar part isn't really consistent. It's just kind of playing notes that go with that chord.
Precisely. I mean, Lou's guitar playing style is summed up by the famous quote: 1 chord is fine, 2 chords are pushing it, 3 chords and you're into jazz. Which I think typifies Lou's guitar. It's very economical. It does what it needs to do on a couple of songs. It's sort of, because Velvet Underground, the thing is particularly notable compared to a lot of 60s rock, because it sort of starts doing that thing that obviously the Doors would later do, is there's not really a fixed bass player. Sometimes there's bass, sometimes there's not. So Lou basically plays guitar on most of this album. John Cale basically seems to play every other instrument on this. So he's principally the band's electric viola player, and his work is typified by this very heavy droning style. He plays piano on a few tracks, usually obviously the same tracks he's playing viola on. He plays bass on a few tracks, and obviously the Celesta, which opens the album. Sterling essentially sort of floats between guitar and bass guitar, and obviously more in sticks to drums, and occasionally tambourine, because there's a little, the drum work on this, I think, as we've obviously already indicated, is very sparse. It's sort of, it does precisely what it needs to, and not an iota more.
Exactly.
So let's just start at the beginning of the record and work through to the end. But the sound of the Velvet Underground is, I hesitate to say dark. Dark is the wrong word. It's very, and it's sort of like, it is almost like a collision, far more than I would even say anything like, the Beatles. I mean, we obviously have Revolver, which is where the Beatles really start getting into experimental music, culminating with Tomorrow Never Knows, which is completely mind-blowing to a sort of 60s audience.
Yeah.
But it's sort of, it's basically a collision of sort of, I would say, pop music, elements of psychedelic rock, which is a genre that's starting to get going, experimental rock, and obviously, the art rock, which essentially the band pretty much found on this album.
Don't forget how many people call this proto-punk.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is, without talking about, the way that this essentially, because the sound of this album, considering, Andy Warhol is bankrolling it, is not this sort of highly polished. I mean, if you compare this to, I would say, even something which sort of copies the same sort of narrative ground, which is something like the early Stooges. It's very,
which were incidentally produced by John Cale, weren't they?
Exactly, yeah, absolutely.
That's where that piano bit from "I Want to Be Your Dog" comes from.
Yeah, which is like, you get this interplay where these sort of the Velvet Underground then sort of almost dissipate their knowledge and their way of producing record out. Yeah, but it's sort of, the sense of it is this sort of slightly ominousness, sort of, I guess, sort of bisected by Reed's more poppy sensibility, because Reed for all the his alternative sort of thing, writes the majority of the sort of the shorter, and I guess more, I hesitate to say more approachable, but certainly the more sonically grounded sort of stuff. So
yeah, I get that.
We start with Sunday Morning, and Sunday Morning sort of brings you into the record in a really nice way. This is also the last track produced for the album. It sort of sets the mood very well. It's this sort of slightly hazy sensibility. It's the Celesta, which obviously starts the record out, is sort of, it's not disconcerting, but there is
about the instrumentation.
Yeah.
So that includes the Celesta, and it also includes a miniature xylophone, like the kind that marching bands use. And how that happened was John Cale added it when he noticed the instrument laying in the corner, and he went, "Hey, let's add that," and then so they did.
That's how they did it in the 60s.
That's how that bit got on there.
Yeah. So it basically, I do think this is sort of, the one track where Reed is sort of, because it doesn't sound like Reed. It took me.
No, because like Nico was supposed to sing it, and then he's like, "No, fuck that! I don't want Nico singing this." But then he starts singing it in a way that I don't get this description, but apparently everyone involved in the recording thought he sounded very feminine, and they were like, "Is this really Nico singing?" And I don't hear it, but
which isn't helped by the fact that
he's singing differently than he sings anywhere else.
Yeah, it's a much softer. I mean, it sort of has this sort of hazy, Sunday morning come down from excessive partying. It's sort of this very, I would say, I hesitate to say wistful. It's not wistful, but it is it's very
calmly
calmly
paranoid.
Yeah,
if I may. I described this to you earlier. This is like, it may well have been one of the things that inspired David Lynch, but this is like David Lynch before David Lynch.
Yeah.
But although obviously he had Lynch likes 50s stuff more and that kind of nostalgia and using that against like really serious things. But this has a very sense of this would be a very nice pop song. And you could just put it on the background and not know it's what it's about, and then suddenly you pay more attention and it's just like oh, we are getting into something darker or something worse, and that could be a lot of the album. And then it slowly deteriorates, maybe not quite there's to the level like maybe a Mulholland Drive would deteriorate, but it does get there. I mean, to Heroin, which we will definitely talk a whole lot about.
Oh, I have things to say.
Yes, but it's that a lot of this is a lot of pop sounding stuff to things that wouldn't normally be in a pop songs.
Yeah.
Like Sunday Morning is just like you're waking up after, a party or something and your world's behind you, and it's not particularly a good mood, but there's the music trying to emphasize like maybe the sun's shining outside, maybe something, but inside you're not feeling the greatest. So
Warhol was the one who suggested that the lyrics be about paranoia, and that's when Reed added the line, watch out, the world's behind you.
Yeah.
And Lou Reed called this sense that someone is always watching you, quote, the ultimate paranoid statement in that the world even cares enough to watch you.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was basically a sort of it is notably different from the rest of the album. It's cleaner production. It's lusher production. It feels like the album
Nico's doing the backing vocals, which she doesn't do on any of the other tracks that she's on.
Yeah.
Though Warhol and Morrissey wanted her to.
Yeah. And it's like, and basically to the extent that the master tape just has it penciled in, like everything else is inked in, and then it's like, I guess we'll put one extra track, which is Tom Wilson, who produces this and obviously a couple of the other Velvet Underground albums, and it's sort of this dream. You could almost regard this as sort of almost proto dream pop in a sense, to a degree. But it's
I hear that,
and then the next track drops in, and this is
that's when you know what this album's really going to be about,
Yeah, and this is like, I mean, we talked about music dynamics a lot on this album. This is like suddenly being just sideswiped by this sort of the churning introduction of I'm Waiting for the Man, which is just this
that driving beat, that's simple,
and the barrel house sort of piano on it, which is
that droning piano,
which is about scoring heroin.
And it's like the lyrics are about material that a lot of people would find shocking, especially back then, but the lyrics do not read sensationally or like they're meant to shock. They just read like a factual description of events. Like, I went to get some heroin. This is how it went.
It comes off like just a straight 60s, early 60s rock song.
Exactly.
About scoring heroin.
And then you have to like pay real close attention. It's like, why is this guy waiting for the man? What is this? Oh. The man is the guy who has the drugs.
So this is where again Bowie and Reed so Bowie gets an acetate. Now we're going to talk about acetates in a bit, because we are going to talk briefly about the let's talk about that now. So there is before the album is released, there is an acetate, which is basically I guess it's sort of equivalent to like a demo version of the album. Now this acetate is an interesting thing because it basically contains sort of alternate mixes, and I believe that obviously this acetate changes hands for absolutely bonkers amount of money, because it's sort of it basically is the closest we will ever get to a demo tape of the Velvet Underground and Nico. So the acetate is basically cut it's essentially a work in progress mix of several of the albums. In 66, and basically you get people copying this acetate, and Bowie gets a copy of the acetate and basically learns I'm waiting for the man, completely misinterprets the lyrics and assumes it is about a very different kind of scoring. Yes, it's about again encountering involving money. No, David, no.
Yeah, that's what
you'd like to think.
And then I listened to it a second and third time, and obviously read the lyrics, and then all music just tells you what the song's about.
Even at 14, I never thought it was anything about anything but scoring heroin.
Okay. But anyway, the acetate, briefly, just to go back, sort of re-emerges in like 2002, and someone buys it from a flea market for 75 cents.
God.
It then gets sold at auction for £25,000.
Good Lord.
Then obviously I think someone from the Velvets gets a copy of this, because it then reappears on obviously the stupidly large deluxe version of the 45th anniversary version, which obviously includes all the acetate and more extra bits, which obviously are just other alternate mixes. And eventually the acetate is issued on vinyl finally in 2013 for Record Store Day. But yeah, this is the moment that the Velvet Underground essentially become the Velvet Underground. It's this sort of, you get Lou Reed's sort of very sparse guitar, you get the piano, John Cale's sort of almost thumping barrel house piano, and then obviously you get the droning sort of from Cale's sort of viola as well. And it's sort of like, this is the moment the Velvet Underground sort of arrive as a band, and obviously it's proto garage rock, proto punk. Frankly, we could do an entire episode on basically the careers that were probably launched by this album, by this song alone, because it is just the arrival of an entirely different way of making rock music.
Yeah, you're right. There's not much more to say.
And on to the next track, and enter the other key theme of the album, which is sadomasochism and
no, Femme Fatale is the next track.
Femme Fatale is
which
I would kind of best describe it as like a 50s kind of rock song, except the lyrics go farther than what would just be suggesting. Like it's obviously about a woman who just stomps on men's hearts and rips them apart and just uses them for fun, but it goes a lot farther. But it still does it in kind of a 50s rock band version. Like you still hear the backup going, she's a femme fatale, like a 50s rock band would.
I'd like to posit an alternative interpretation of the song. I showed this song to my brother, who is very queer, and who said it immediately came off as a lesbian song, like she's singing from experience about this woman.
I mean, I don't think there's ever been a female version. I would absolutely love to hear a female version of this.
Well, no. What do you mean there's no female version of Femme Fatale?
I can't find a female version of Femme Fatale.
You mean sung by a woman or
sung by a woman?
It is sung by Nico's a woman.
Oh my god! Oh shit!
Is she not? Is she not?
This is one of her 3 songs.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure she's a woman.
Okay, I don't. Sorry. No, absolutely. So this is Nico's first real appearance on the album, and again, it's sort of you get Lou writes. Lou has often been compared to writing like a novelist, and it's like it's these sort of vignettes of like, she's got this book of all the people she's written in, all the boyfriends she's had. Oh, you're only number 37. She and it's sort of this very, very beautifully done thing. I mean, Nico's vocals on this are probably the best on the record. And this is about Eddie Sedgwick. Am I correct in?
Yeah, that's
Warhol's It Girl.
It's about her. She was the 1966 Factory Girl of the Year, and Warhol said that Reed should write a song about her, and he said, "Oh, don't you think she's a femme fatale?" And that's where the song title came from, and so we wrote it and gave it to Nico.
I mean, we should point out
Cedric actually danced on stage with the Velvet Underground to this song at the Cinematheque.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully she knew what it was about, but I don't know. Maybe people at a certain ego just like it's just about me.
Yeah. No, I think I mean, we should point out at this point, Lou Reed was Reed was bisexual.
Well, that's up for debate. Yeah. Like, I did a little looking into it, and the thing that most people tend to point to when talking about his sexuality is they talk about, I don't recall her name, but this one drag queen / trans woman with whom he was involved. But I don't know, being involved with a woman sounds pretty straight to me.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he then goes on to marry Laurie Anderson, the Experiment American.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is the thing, but Andy Warhol was absolutely, obviously, we've had this comment again, that Warhol was probably gay and asexual. Which,
well, I've been wondering whether or not he actually was asexual, because, okay, so he has a book, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol from A to B and to B again. What is the subtitle? What is the subtitle? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Anyway, he claims to have written it. It was ghost written, but he provided all the information about himself and clearly wants us to think that everything he said in it comes from him. So I'm just going to talk about things in it like he said them.
Yeah, from A to B and back again is the book.
A to B and back again. Thank you. Sorry, what was my point in bringing this up?
Oh, Andy Warhol's sexuality.
Oh, it's about sex. There's an entire chapter about sex where if you read it at face value, it sounds like he's talking about being asexual. But then I reread it and realized, oh yeah, a lot of people who are gay and who are closeted, and especially in relationships or dating people of the gender they're not into and having sex with them, which was something that Warhol did. He dated women. He talks about it in the book. So maybe it's not asexuality. Maybe it's a tiredness with sex that obviously comes from when you're only having sex with people you're not attracted to. That said, if he was asexual, that wouldn't be surprising either. And given that he did have male lovers, now that I think about it, it's also very likely that he had sex with men. He had that with comparison. Yeah. So,
I mean, Warhol seems
to only get away with writing about sex with women, but clearly he's thinking about sex with multiple genders.
For sure. I mean, Warhol's general thing is just, he has this aesthetic, from my knowledge of obviously him as an artist, he has this aesthetic, I almost would say, obsession with the everyday, the normal.
Oh, absolutely. That's his whole thing.
Yeah, which obviously, he makes stars out of not only ordinary people, ordinary objects, but I would say ordinary people to an extent.
Well, ordinary people who have got something going on with them.
In this case being
that kind of ordinary.
A very loud rock band. So, I mean, certainly Femme Fatale is one of the sort of I guess the prettiest songs on the album. It's sort of,
I think I'll Be Your Mirror is very beautiful.
Which is like all the three songs with Nico's vocals that just have this sort of ethereal. So, I mean, Nico later goes on to have a career where she basically becomes the
goth.
The original sort of goth ice queen of gothicism. You get things like the Marble Index, which is a beautiful but absolutely stark and austere sort of pillar of an album. But back to the so we get Venus in Furs. And Venus in Furs is
now, that song is associated with a lot of firsts for the band. It was one of the songs they played at their first show. It was their first media exposure when it was filmed by CBS and included in a documentary about Piero Helizar, I think that's how you say his name, and the underground film scene in New York. And it was the first song that Gerard Malanga danced to the night that he took Warhol back to the Cafe Bazaar to hear the Velvets play.
And one of the first these songs to be re-recorded for the album. So this is basically the sort of, I guess, the typical, this is the sound the Velvet Underground become known as. It is this almost unrelenting sort of raga-ish drone, I suppose. Again, the only thing
it was Sterling Morrison's favorite Velvet Underground song, and he used to say that in it they had achieved, like in no other track, the sound that they had in mind.
Precisely. I mean, you can compare this in a sort of a roundabout way to sort of Tomorrow Never Knows, but Tomorrow Never Knows is
less cohesive than this.
Precisely, yeah. It's Tomorrow Never Knows is, the baby. This is a wall of just this sort of almost sitarish, it's sort of this ominous sensibility. You've got Lou's guitar tuned to an unexpected, interesting, alternative tuning. You've got obviously Mo Tucker's absolutely titanic sort of drums on this, which sort of people have compared this drum in its own relenting sort of boom, boom, boom sort of sensibility to John Bonham's work on When the Levee Breaks. And you just have, Lou's vocals on this, which are just, absolutely unrelenting. There's this is, I've heard this on a big system, and it's just like the thing fills the room. And this is, I think, as I think I've commented earlier, this is the one thing which you don't really get on this album, which is, how loud this band were in a live environment. Obviously, White Heat, White Light, which is the next album, which is obviously we'll come to in a bit, is a better document of how the Velvets were as a live band.
I think of all the songs on the album, I think European Sun comes closest to capturing it, but it still doesn't fully.
No, I mean, it's, this is an absolute, I mean, this is, I think Reed compared the sound to the, sounding like a B-52 taking off.
Yeah.
Just absolute, wall of sound. But, to the point that I think during some gigs, because obviously Mo is at the back, Lou is having to turn to her. And this is obviously in the documentary about the band, which is obviously, and Lou is having to make hand signals to Mo because Mo cannot hear anything that anybody that cannot even, is so loud that all Mo can actually just hear is literally the chord changes. So it's like, he's having to sort of make hand signals to drummer who's like 10 feet away. That's the sort of volume they're playing at. But it also is sort of, I guess this is where the band sort of get into their sort of literary thing. So this is obviously takes as influence.
Yes, Venus and Furs.
Leopold de Saint-Germain.
Yeah, from whom the word masochism comes.
Yeah, so it's very much sort of, this is the thing. They get the Velvet Underground are not, there's a sense of sort of, again, matter of factness. It's like.
Yeah, he's just describing what happens in pursuit of this encounter.
Exactly. It's like, well, I've gone and scored some heroin. I've sung a song, and now I'm going to get, involved.
Now I'm going to go beaten up by the woman who does this to me consensually.
Exactly. It's very, and again, it's sort of this sense of, but the thing is, the Velvet Underground are supremely good at creating these moods. It's sort of like, it's like, it opens and it is like just walking into a completely different thing. The band create this sort of, slightly Middle Eastern sounding sort of sensibility.
Oh yeah, because they were totally very much inspired by Middle Eastern.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. But no, absolutely. Joe, any thoughts on this?
I have weird thoughts about Venus in First just because I don't really like the song very much to the shock of everybody. And this, I am coming from this as a guy who has never heard this album before, and I don't really have the history. I am a person who has been slowly going back through music like decade at a time. And I am early 70s at this point. I don't know how far back I'm going to get. I'm probably going to get back to the 50s. I'm like, yeah, I'm good. This is all just like the same song over and over again when I get to the 50s. But, obviously I've listened to the Beatles, and, Revolver is one of my favorite albums. But I don't really like white dudes playing around with sitars music.
That's fair.
I don't know.
No, I get you.
It comes off as very touristy, and like how a lot of people like Bollywood, just because it's weird. It's like, oh, they stop and they just dance and they sing in this part, in this weird part or something like that. And it's just like, it feels, and Tomorrow Never Knows is an untouchable song, so they can get away with that.
Plus,
but,
plus George is extreme interchange with, obviously the Indian subcontinent. There is a great cover of this, just by the by, because obviously a lot of these songs do get covered, by the American metal band the Melvins, where they did a split with Nirvana. And it starts off as like a serious cover, and then it does the normal sort of Melvins thing, where it's like a minute, it's like 2 minutes long, and like the second half is just bizarre, but not this.
Anyway, the song is a little slow for my taste, and like a lot of things, like what the song is about is a little bit hidden. I mean, obviously, if you listen to the words,
I don't think it's hidden.
I don't know, but
I don't think it's hidden.
Okay, but if you just listen to, I'm a typical guy. When I hear the song, I hear the music, and it's a very slow, kind of droning song, and there's none of the feeling of like being like owned by this fabulously rich woman. In the same way, like heroin is obviously about how you're being on heroin. Like it's just, there's this disconnect between how the song feels from a sonic level and what it's about. So that is kind of my problem with it.
That's fair. I would say certainly of the lot, heroin does capture it does have the sort of the sonic mirror to its lyrical content the best, absolutely, without difficulty. I certainly think this is probably this and the last 2 tracks are certainly where the Velvet Underground sort of push, the idea of what a rock song can be to sort of, its outward limits, at least for the 1970s. And then we have Run Run Run, and Run 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 feels like, again, it's another one of Reed's character pieces where he sort of like he does a lot of these characters. I mean, he would take this even further in term with Reed's sort of actual solo career, with obviously his later music. I mean, this typified by was it Berlin, or I know one of the tracks, certainly he does this nearly 10-minute thing, and it's sort of this almost this 3 or 4 piece sort of thing, and it's Lou Reed tells stories. Street Hassle, which obviously Reed features by the way, an uncredited Bruce Springsteen. But he does these things where he sort of he builds these these narratives a lot alongside the music. He tells these stories about people, and these are more of Reed's characters in Run Run Run. It's just certainly the most normal sounding.
Yeah, it is.
You know, the
It is. It is the
It's
one I
rock and
forget.
roll, but it's
Yeah.
not as like hard and driving
No.
as Waiting for the Man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the one I most forget is on this album.
Yeah.
I mean, not because it's bad. It's
No.
a perfectly fine song. It's
Yeah.
just it feels like I'm waiting for the man part 2 because it's a brief.
Yeah.
They're brief stories about all of these people, and they're all going for drugs.
Yeah. I mean, like Blue Ridge vocals on this, they're very like, run, 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 take a drag or two, what you do. You know, it's that very, you know, Lou Reed, considering sort of, you know, he became sort of, you know, short in the sort of last decade and a half before his death, you know, of just this voice that basically, you know, barely, you know, sort of grumbling his way through, you know, records. He's got a very good singing voice at points on this record, and where he needs to have, you know, a good vocal, this is very, you know, good. I don't have very much to say about this either. It's good. It does certainly feel like the most, you know, typical song on the album. It's certainly, you know, this would fit in quite nicely, you know, a couple of years later with something like, you know, 13th Floor Elevators or something like that to my ears anyway.
You know, a little bit about the drug speak and lyrics. As a verb, run in the world of heroin users refers to the frantic chase to find money and or dope to buy with said money. And to be on a run means basically you're going on a heroin bender, which is where the rushing on my run line from heroin comes from. And the line about beardless Harry being unable to get a small town taste is a tiny amount of heroin. Like
the
amount you might find in a small bag in a small town.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, you know, Reed is steeped in this culture.
Yeah, so of course he's
worse.
writing like that.
He's writing what he knows. And then
he directly said that he was writing about stuff that he could relate to or that he had seen in the people in his life. Which is like pretty good place to write from.
Yeah, and certainly we do have, you know, the sense of Reed. I think we obviously commented Reed to sort of sort out, particularly before the Velvet Underground, these sort of dangerous experiences that he could then use for material, which is sort of like not what I would recommend as a writer person.
Yeah.
Which
is
like
when you're a writer, what you do is you get yourself into the dangerous experience unintentionally. You think, I should write about this, and then you think, how do I get out?
Yeah.
That's what you do when you're a writer.
Yeah, certainly. And then we have what I would describe as the single best song the Velvet Underground ever did.
I disagree, but it's
that's
up there.
Upset. So All Tomorrow's Party sort of starts off, this is obviously in the sort of the demo period before obviously Tucker joins the band, as a sort of weirdly folksy version, which ironically is, you know, given sort of Reed and Cale's sort of dislike for the hippie movement. And it transforms into this is just extra. I mean, this song is just, I've described this as sort of this, I think I've mentioned certainly to you, Jude, of being that sort of that period from sort of the start of the 90s. It's basically 1960, the vibe, the sense of 1966 to 69.
Distilled in the song.
Distilled. It starts off with this brilliantly low in the mix bass line, and then the piano kicks in, and it's just extraordinary. This it's everything. It's, you know, it's got this almost cinematic scale to it. It's, you know,
oh yeah, it's very cinematic. I imagine like a camera panning over the crowd at the Warhol factory.
Precisely.
Because it was about the people at the Warhol factory.
Precisely.
What because Lou Reed would go there and he would take notes, like he would write down conversations, behavioral quirks, and interactions with the people at the factory. He may have been the only person to turn the tables on Andy, who also took such a role. What he said was, I watched Andy. I watched Andy watching everybody. I would hear people say the most astonishing things, the craziest things, the funniest things, the saddest things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is this mirror up to the entire, the factory. Yes, absolutely. But almost the sort of,
you mentioned a mirror. Sorry. It's mirrors kept, when I was doing research for this, mirrors kept coming up. There were all those mirrors hanging in the Warhol factory.
For sure, yeah.
There's I'll Be Your Mirror. In the Warhol book, let me get the quote. He talks about being a mirror. What he sorry, hang on.
That's all right. A topic you've got, Nico's vocals on this, which are just, this sort of, this Teutonic maestro above this, this malaise.
But what Warhol said of himself was, I'm sure I'm going to look in the mirror and see nothing. People are always calling me a mirror, and if a mirror looks into a mirror, what is there to see? Because he saw, I think he really saw himself as a reflection of his time and place, and
and a record, and a recorder of that as well. And you've obviously got that sort of tack piano, that sort of prepared piano that gives it that sort of jangly.
But with regards to Warhol, if I can say one more thing, I don't know if he was really as empty as he thought.
No.
I don't believe that a human can be as much of a solely reflective service as Warhol says he is. The person he presents in the autobiography comes off as someone who isn't, but wants to be nothing. He doesn't want to contain things. Whatever he contains is either painful or uninteresting to him, or maybe both, and it's something he doesn't want to be. He'd rather be nothing, and he'd rather people thought he was nothing. That's why he talks about not having problems and wanting to take on other people's problems, so he'll have problems of his own, because that's the thing he talks about in the book. He tried to fill himself with things, and to him, things included other people. He filled himself with people and products and projects, and he tried to be a mirror in all cases. But you start noticing smudges on that mirror that form the outline of a human being, and that was Warhol as a person.
Definitely. And the thing is, it's... And this is obviously the first track that actually gets released as a single, nearly a year before.
I'll Be Your Mirror was the B-side.
Yeah, which I think is a perfect duo of songs. But it is just this, the vocals are perfect. The thematic thing is perfect. It is this slice of what it must have been like, even reflected and sort of revised, this is I guess a character study, but it feels like, this character reflects in themselves the entire period, this idea of, costumes and never ending parties. And
it's a character study, but but the character is that time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And it's time for me to cut in, I suppose. It's it is an extremely good song. I'm not going to go like Venus and Furs on it, but it's like, it feels like the moment of clarity and honesty in the album, where there is just like the emptiness and sadness, and like you said, it was like pointing out the shadow of this movement and what they were doing, and what was going on at the factory, and later what would be going on around the Chelsea Hotel and stuff like that, where it's just like, it's a movement, we're doing meaningful, artful things, but are we really doing anything than just getting really fucked up on drugs, and then just kind of waking up in the morning and just feeling real bad about ourselves, and what are we doing with ourselves? It's kind of that moment of clarity, and it captured it absolutely fantastically. And that it kind of feels like the core of the album, that it's just like this, what is going on underneath, or just like from a fundamental level, what are we just doing physically? We're just going out, we're getting drugs, we're getting really screwed up, we're waking up in the morning, and then we're
Repeat.
struggling to do it again, and that's this is, and you know, it doesn't feel what we're feeling like we're doing, or what our mission statement are just kind of disparate from each other.
Precisely. No, I would agree entirely. It does, you know, it is very, very much, and obviously it ends the first side, and sort of for the second side, you know, there is a darkness, I guess, that has, you know, descended upon the rest of the record from this point onwards. You know, this is the end of the party, so to speak.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from here that we go.
How about that next song?
How about the next?
Yes.
Oh boy.
The one
the
even
best
I
song
knew.
on the album.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And would later get from where I kind of know it is like getting slaughtered by Billy Idol.
Yes, the Billy Idol man. So
should I not listen to it?
It's part of an album, the Billy Idol album Cyberpunk, which is an inevitable victim for our appreciation at some point. Where it also gets mashed up bizarrely enough with Patti Smith's Gloria, so it's like double John Cale.
And just to explain where in existence this is like the early 90s, where if you know Demolition Man by the Police as the original 80s song about a dictator and about how you're in deep shit if you cross him. But then in the 90s, Sting did this total pop version of Demolition Man for the movie Demolition Man, where you just have this choir going, hey, that, and you know, it's, you know, rocking. There's some like beat, but it's very middle of the road. It's very like early 90s. That is where Billy Idol's Cyberpunk is, and that is what that version of Heroin sounds like.
Yeah, not so much missing the point as ending up about 20 or so blocks from the point and wondering how on earth you get back to it.
I see.
Yes.
But Heroin is a song, as the name might suggest, about heroin.
Yeah.
And it's sort of again where the sort of the psychedelic and, you know, certainly the most the experimental part of heroin, you know, a hot part of the Velvet Underground re-emerge. And it's sort of you get obviously, you know, and again it's, you know, it's Reed doing a, you know, essentially another, although this is far more straight for sort of, you know, stream of conscious on this.
Yeah,
it is very clear what this song is doing when you listen to it. But the more you listen to it, the more details you get. It is you get it right off the bat, and is more rewarding as you listen to it and continue to listen to it, which is why I think it is the song that has, you know, stood tallest of all the rest of them.
Yeah, here's what Lou Reed had to say about it. Heroin is very close to the feeling you get from smack. It starts on a certain level. It's deceptive. You think you're enjoying it, but by the time it hits you, it's too late. You don't have any choice. It comes at you harder and faster and keeps on coming. The song is everything that the real thing is doing to you.
For sure.
So,
and yeah, absolutely. It certainly captures.
It very much scared me. When I was 14 and I heard it, I was like, I am never doing drugs of any kind. And of course, that ended poorly for me. This is a song that I listened to. I was not addicted to heroin, but in my days as an addict, I did relate to this song quite a bit, especially the I'm going to try to nullify my life part.
Yeah, I mean, Lou Reed himself in an interview in 1971 says, I meant those songs to sort of exercise the darkness or the self-destructive element in me and hoped other people would take them the same way. But when I saw how people responded to them, it was disturbing because, like, people would come up to me and say, I shot up to heroin, things like that. For a while, I was even thinking that some of my songs may have contributed formatively to the consciousness of these addictions and things going on with the kids today. But I don't think that anymore. It's really too awful a thing to consider. And certainly the Velvet Underground did come in for criticism from, you know, the media of going, yeah, you have written a song about doing drugs. at a period where, you know, the 1960s, it was like, yeah, you know, we are at this point, you know, 2 or 3 years out from the Summer of Love and everybody in the world being stoned.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it always has a weird thing like that. Like I had similar experience talking to somebody about Requiem for a Dream, where obviously it is an anti-drug movie and about, you know, how deep of a hole you can get yourself under. And then there was a person I was talking to and it's just like, man, that movie just makes me want to shoot up all the more. And it's like, what the fuck?
Yeah, it's one of those things. Yeah, it's one of those things that goes, and how have you managed to misinterpret it in this way precisely?
It's the drugs carving in. That's what's doing it.
It's. I mean, yeah. It is, but it is. You know, it's a very well produced song. It sort of comes back to that sort of raga-ish sensibility, but it's sort of, you know, this very, you know, this is 2 chords. Like it goes, it basically cycles back and forth as Sister Ray would do on White Heat, White Light, to an almost, you know, baroque sort of level. And it's sort of, you know, it's very much an economy of guitar in this. I mean, the structure of this song is basically it builds to a crescendo and then goes back to obviously the thing, you know, it sort of it does, you know, feel like, you know, obviously it recreates very impressively sonically and lyrically the sort of the idea of, you know, taking heroin.
And every time this happens, it gets worse and worse, and like the guitar gets more distorted and it gets more rushed. And one of the things I noticed from the last time I listened to it, it's like life still goes on. There's still like near the end of the song, there's still shitty things and it's still going, and it just implies the cycle is just going to keep going and going and getting worse.
And then there's obviously the Reed would obviously, this has become obviously a statement of Reed's own thing, culminating in the live album Rock and Roll Animal released in 1974, which featured a 14-minute version of Heroin.
Oh, wow.
Featuring 2 guitarists that would eventually come on to be in Alice Cooper's band, because the music world is a very small place. And from the sort of the darkness of Heroin, we go back to, I think, the second shortest track on the album, which is There She Goes Again, which is
they put the worst song after the best song.
Yeah, I think There Where She Goes Again is it's throwaway. I mean, the Velvet Underground, particularly on the last 2 albums they did, because Squeeze doesn't count. Okay, very brief aside. So Squeeze is an album produced by the Velvet Underground. It's the Velvet Underground in inverted commas, because at this point the Velvet Underground had lost all of their members. This is in 1971, I want to say. 1973. It features no original member of the band and features Doug Yule, who had joined the band after John Cale left after White Heat, White Light, as the only sole member. It is not a Velvet Underground album, and I refuse to refer to it as such. But yeah, There She Goes is, you know, it's Lou's sort of little jingle songs. It's very jangly. It's sort of got that sort of mid-60s sort of thing, you know, that the Beatles did very well on their earlier album. It's just sort of there. It's like, I feel it works, but then again, the next track, it works, it's there, it does what it needs to do. It sort of, I feel if you had this in European, you know, something like the Black Angels Death Song back to back, that's far too heavy. You need a breather.
Okay. And just what I would add to it is it's like Run, Run, Run. It's like this second kind of version of a song, because we have Femme Fatale, which is like this 50s rock song, but it's about, you know, this woman who, it goes far beyond it. And then There She Goes Again it's, you know, a typical pop song, but it's about this woman who is a prostitute, and it's about her going around getting blowjobs, not feeling bad about it.
Yeah. Why not?
So, you know, it's fine, but it's been done earlier in the album, and Femme Fatale is more memorable.
Yeah.
Obviously as one of the songs that Nico sings, and for other reasons. So
yeah,
there's it works, but there's better stuff that did the same thing earlier.
Yeah, which is not what we can say about I'll Be Your Mirror, which I think is the nicest song on the album.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a sweet song. It's I mentioned that Lou Reed and Nico were lovers at one point. This is where that song came from. Nico said, "Oh, Lou, I'll be your mirror," and he was like, "That's a great song idea." So they put it on the album.
Yeah, and it's nice. It's nice. There was a plan. Warhol wanted basically, I think, one of the sides of this to end.
Oh yeah, the crack in the vinyl.
So it would essentially loop the final bit of "I'll Be Your Mirror" over and over, in the same way that the run out groove on Sgt. Pepper's sort of repeats its laughing, bizarre, inane sound effects.
Turn me on, dead band.
And then the band, the band loved this so much. When they would produce this after she left, when they played this after she left the band in 1967, at the end of '67, they just imitate her voice. Like, I think it must have been Lucy, because obviously I think Maureen. I hesitate to imagine Maureen Tucker doing a German accent, but there we go. Yeah, but it's a nice little song, and I feel it's certainly better than There She Goes. Will be, it sort of adds as a nice sort of stopgap between this and the last two tracks on the album.
Yeah, it feels like kind of a mission statement of what they are trying to what people are trying to find in these relationships and these circumstances, and that those moments of I don't want to say emotional purity, but it's just like a purpose or some kind of help. And obviously that will get lost within everything else in the album, and obviously what follows.
Yeah, for sure. What follows is probably the two most experimental tracks on the album.
Absolutely.
which are Black Angel's Death Song and European Sun. Now these are very interesting tracks, because certainly Black Angel's Death Song originates from certainly the pre-Velvet era. To the extent that the Velvets basically were playing the Cafe Bazaar, which I've mentioned earlier, in Greenwich for a fortnight in 1965. As part of this set, they play European Death Song, Black Angel's Death Song.
Wait, is this a story about how they got fired?
Yes,
because that was actually European Sun.
Oh, was it European Sun? Okay.
It was European Sun.
It was European Sun. Anyway,
sorry, it was Black Angel's Death Song.
But they play it to go, and the manager goes up to them and says, "Yeah, if you play that again, the bad things will happen." And this is sort of like, this is at like maximum volume, full on psychedelic freak out rock, and feedback, and John Cale hissing into the microphone in his only major vocal appearance on this album, and they promptly play it again and get sacked.
Yeah, the exact story is that they were being forced to work on Christmas.
Oh my god.
And they were just rather pissed off, and so they played Black Angel's Death Song, and the owner came up to them on a break and said, "You play that song one more time and you're fired." So they opened with it the next set, and it was the best version of it that they ever played.
Yeah.
And this was just 2 nights after Warhol came to see them for the first time. Shortly after this, some people came up and said, "Hey, would you like to have a record contract?" And they said, "Might as well."
Yeah, and certainly it is the most sort of free associative track. I mean, these lyrics are sort of they're being compared to sort of Elliot T and sort of free association sort of stuff.
Yeah, me, I am normally the person who interprets the lyrics and stuff, because I'm not the music person of this. Like I couldn't make it as a percussionist in sixth grade band. They had to throw me onto the triangle and the wood block to make it through their concerts. So obviously I jumped towards the lyrics, and I'm just looking at the lyrics of this, and it's just like, I don't know, man. I don't know.
It's probably about drugs.
Yeah, obviously.
It's either probably or obviously about drugs, but it is the sort of the sense of, you know, this is where the Velvet Underground sort of really get into sort of, you know, really high volume experimentalism. And going back to Morrissey, this is one of Morrissey as in the Smiths Morrissey.
Guy.
The Smiths guys album discs on the British television, British radio series Desert Island Discs. So good song. I like this. I think this sort of this duo. Yeah,
it's okay.
It's okay.
I probably need to listen to it like 10 more times to like, I not necessarily get it, but like absorb it, because it just feels like it bounces off me. Because I don't know if I'm just like, there's a part of it that's my brain is not accepting, or just like there,
it's not clicking.
It's not clicking. No, not at all.
Yeah, that's fair. But anyway, we come to the final track on the album, which is European Sun, which is basically very, very light on lyrics. It's a retort to Delmore Schwartz, an American
it was dedicated to him, who under whom Lou Reed studied. And it's Schwartz hated Reed's lyrics, so he intentionally dedicated to him the one with the least lyrics.
Yeah, ironically, so on the first pressing, it is dedicated to Delmore Schwartz, who was still alive at the time they recorded it, but had died by the time the album comes out. We'll talk about the time the album took to come out in a bit. And it starts with basically this sort of typical rock and roll-y sort of line about spitting on under those under 21, and your clowns say goodbye, and a green wallpaper, and then all hell breaks loose. Because sort of it basically, the sound effect is apparently Cale throwing or dropping a chair, and then it sort of goes into this sort of psychedelic sort of experimental sort of freak out, which sort of obviously again sort of feels like a precursor to
this feels like this is the entire Doors career.
Yeah, at once. Like piano keyboard noodling, it's sort of sound effects, absolute chaos. And it's sort of, I feel this has to come at the end, because it is just, where do you go from this? A nearly 8-minute experimental unleashing.
Yeah, it's the perfect ending song.
Yeah, and it's just sort of like, bloody hell. And then, this obviously hits the can, and obviously everybody goes, oh, this is great, we'll record this, this is now, done. And then it sort of sits there for a while. So obviously they record this, they cut the acetate, and essentially Reed starts, Reed and Reed's sort of assistant, which is let me find the name, which is Dolph, who essentially produces the album, sort of starts shopping them around, and it's sort of like, what do we do with this? This is like unlike anything else. So they shop them, they try and take them to Atlantic Records. Atlantic Letters goes, there are far too many drug references in these songs. Elektra goes, no, we don't like Cale and only Cale's viola on this. And then MGM's Velvet Records goes, okay, and obviously they come back and record 3 of the songs, and then obviously record for Sunday Morning. And it's sort of, and obviously Warhol does some promotion for the album. And it's basically releases, as we started the episode with just a shrug. It's like the album's content doesn't help this. Basically it gets banned from most record stores, a lot of radio stations refuse to play it, and magazines won't advertise for it. And Verve also cannot be bothered to actually market this thing. So it enters the charts at number 199, and then leaves the charts 195. And then they recall the album because obviously Eric Emerson at this point has popped up and gone.
This was actually the thing about the whole Eric Emerson thing. That was what kept the album from reaching the top 100. It was just gonna break the top 100 before Eric Emerson sued them.
So the album basically gets recalled for 5 months. It's obviously there are like thousands of copies of this sitting in Verve's warehouses that somebody has to go and basically throw a black piece of tape over. Re-emerges in the charts 182, peaks at 171, and finally leaves the charts at the start of January 1968. And essentially it sells reasonably, it sells reasonably well for what is a very esoteric and avant-garde selection of music. The critical reception is mixed, which is ironic to talk about, one of the greatest albums. The critical, basically, as I think I've said earlier, this is basically like a visitation from like a decade in the future, almost, in musical terms. It's like, how the hell does 1967 sort of look at this and go past the thematic and sonic stuff that this is trying to do? When a decade later, basically bands like, the New York Dolls and Television and the Patti Smith Group turn up and pretty much pick up the baton and go from there. It's sort of interesting to sort of think, it's ironic of sort of the bands that obviously influence this probably, then become commercially successful and etc. And of course, slowly and surely, it obviously starts to pick up a little bit of a thing. And obviously this starts with renowned music writer Robert Christo, who basically goes, in 1967, this went way over our heads. This is really good and only gets better. By the 1980s, this is starting to get a sort of a critical reappraisal. And by the 90s, it is part of the rock canon. It was typified by the fact that the Velvet Underground reform in the early 90s and basically sell out every single concert arena they play at. This is a visitation from the future. I mean, Rolling Stone, this is obviously more contemporaneous polls. 2003, the album Velvet Underground and Nico goes to number 13 on the Rolling Stone list of greatest albums of all time, dropping to number 23 in 2020. Basically tops so many polls of the number one album of all time, or the 50 albums that changed me. This is absolutely a point around where music turns. You cannot have the experimental rock of the 70s. You can't get garage rock. You can't get no wave, new wave. Post-punk. I almost question whether this album would have whether this album did indeed preface punk. The impact of this album, we could be here for hours listing, records that have been influenced by or lifted.
Absolutely.
It's titanic.
I've heard the Velvet Underground referred to as your favorite band's favorite band.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we got to consider this. This is and yet this is the thing. This album, even today. So, according to the Nielsen SoundScan, which is basically the major thing of sort of tracking records, in the United States, this has only sold about 500 million copies in 30 years. This is still, this is like the last thing. This is still, a very And it's the thing, you could talk about other experiment albums of the 60s and late 70s, you know, but this is the, you listen today to sort of, you know, Revolver is still a revelatory album, but it, you know, it sounds like 50 years ago. It sounds like, it sounds like an album of the 60s. This
does not sound like its time.
It doesn't sound like, it sounds, I mean, obviously the production
doesn't really sound like any time, really.
It doesn't sound like any time. It sounds like the Velvet Underground. It sounds like, you know, this album hasn't aged, you know, there's, you know, it feels, it still feels incredible, you know, even with the sort of the slightly, you know, limited production in places, which, you know, we could get into the effect this album had on lo-fi production all day long. And you know how rock and roll were produced, you know, how you start to get this division of experimental rock going off into, you know, lo-fi and sort of, you know, garage rock and etc. And then the other strand is going off into, you know, progressive rock and etc. But it's sort of like, you know, you cannot talk about modern music without mentioning and paying homage to this record.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You're correct in that it doesn't, you know, feel like it belongs in any time, and it's just of this one thing. But it does feel like when 60s music started to become the 70s music, because obviously you will hear a lot of, you know, 70s in it. Like European Sun feels certainly like the Doors and
late,
you know,
Doors, certainly,
like certainly the late Apocalypse Now Doors. But you know, there's also like, you know, my ADHD is hyper focusing, so we got to go back to David Lynch. How there's so many people who want to be David Lynch, but there's only this one David Lynch, and then there's all these people who are obviously following him, but there's only David Lynch gets David Lynch to a certain point, and gets it to this point. So like there are, it's obviously an extremely influential and, you know, one of a kind at the same time.
Yeah. And I think you've gotta say, you know, this is certainly one of my favorite records of all time. This is just going to continue to be. I mean, we're recording this. This is the 55th. We are talking about an album, in all fairness, that is 55 years old. What other media of 55 years ago, with the possible exception of some, you know, stuff like, you know, the Beat Poets, are we still talking about and still analyzing? That's the thing, you know, you perhaps music is an ageless realm in which we can listen to, you know, an album released yesterday, an album released 55 years ago, and sort of weigh them and measure them using the same sort of elements. But yeah.
I think the only thing that would stop me from keeping it is just because I have just been so awash in the world that came after it, because there's so many mutations, so many, you know, more nuances or advanced technology, and it's just like that, like it's people have taken this as inspiration, then just
absolutely, this is like
and then you go back to the original, and so there are, you know, some weak parts. It's like going back to Key the Metal Idol, which is what the thing that influenced all of the things that made me an anime fan. But Key the Metal Idol is not really a great series. It has parts of what everything would become,
for sure,
but people hadn't tinkered it. People hadn't, I don't want to say perfected it, because the Velvet Underground and Nico is still a great album, obviously, but there are people who have just been tinkering it for over 50 years.
For sure.
And
I mean,
I've lived in that world. And so you go back to it's kind of primitive. I mean, it's, but people weren't doing this. Like, this is like, I believe Pink Floyd was doing, I'd like a bike. You can try it if you'd like.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh yes, that's it.
That kind of song.
Oh god, but absolutely, it is like this is going to be a strange thing. It's like coming across a sort of a fossil of one of the sort of the first, oxygen breathing land animals, and it's crude and it looks kind of funky and it's sort of like you can tell it's just, this thing has still like got flippers and it's just come out of the ocean, but it's sort of like it comes back onto land and it's sort of it's just about got both, and that is for better or that is the Velvet Underground and Nico, this sort of this this example of what rock and roll can be at its most experimental fringes. Right.
Yeah,
all right.
You said it all, man.
One epoch-defining album down. Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think we talked about it. We said some things of value.
We have indeed. So,
and then I'm coming in as the color commentator. Bold mood, Cotton. We'll see how that plays out for him.
Absolutely. But anyway, yes. So, Jude, would you like to tell us, plug a few things, because you are only our second guest in history. So.
Oh wow, I feel honored. Well, I'd like to plug my music, Late Frequencies. If you go on Bandcamp, latefrequencies.bandcamp.com. On the subject
and also, Tama, you are on there as well. Promote yourself. You are under the name Shinji Akari. I believe it's just one word.
No, absolutely no. That's changed. I am on Bandcamp because of course, I'm on Bandcamp. I am on Bandcamp under notsofinalrecords.bandcamp.com, where you can actually find, by the way, every single episode of the Thom and Joe show so far, including this one, for the
split that Thom and I were on,
and many other musical things, which reminds me I need to get back to doing music at some point.
So do I.
And I do not have any music on Bandcamp. You're welcome.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah,
God, what are you gonna do, Tama?
I don't know.
I can't sing. I can't play shit. What?
It's fine. We can also be found on Patreon at patreon.com/The Thom and Joe Show. Thom is spelled with a H. Or on Twitter at NotSoFinalProd. We will be back later in the year to talk about another couple of albums having anniversaries, which we will reveal at a later date. But for now, I've been Thom.
I've been Joe.
I've been Jude.
We'll see you later. See you on the next episode of the Thom and Joe Show. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.